There was a time when the Raiders had a weapon that defenses simply could not ignore. He wasn't the biggest receiver, he wasn't the most famous player on the roster, and he certainly wasn't the kind of superstar who needed to dominate every headline. But when the Raiders needed a big play, there was a reason they kept looking in his direction. His name was Cliff Branch, and for years, Branch was one of the most dangerous deep threats in professional football. He was a 3-time first-team All-Pro, a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time Super Bowl champion, and one of the defining offensive weapons of the Raiders' championship era. He led the NFL in receiving yards in 1974 and led the league in touchdown receptions twice. Yet somehow, when the conversation turned to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Branch kept getting left behind, again and again and again. He became a finalist for the Hall of Fame. Then another year passed, another group of players was inducted, and Branch was still outside Canton. The most painful part wasn't simply that he wasn't selected, it was what happened afterward. The longer the wait continued, the easier it became for football history to move on without him. And eventually, one of the most important Raiders of his generation was no longer fighting to get into the Hall. He was fighting to make sure people remembered why he belonged there in the first place. To understand why Branch's story is so frustrating, you have to understand what the Raiders were becoming in the 1970s. Oakland wasn't building an ordinary football team. The franchise was developing an identity. Speed, aggression, confidence, vertical football. The Raiders wanted to attack defenses instead of simply surviving them, and Branch was almost perfectly designed for that philosophy. He wasn't drafted as some guaranteed superstar. Oakland selected him in the 4th round of the 1972 NFL Draft. But very quickly, the Raiders discovered something. Branch could run, really run. And in an era when defenses weren't built around the same passing concepts we see today, that kind of speed could completely change how an opponent defended the field. If a cornerback gave Branch too much room, he could take the top off the defense. If the cornerback pressed him, Branch could threaten him vertically. If the safety cheated toward him, another part of the offense could open. His speed wasn't just a personal advantage. It affected the entire defensive structure. And that became one of the reasons the Raiders kept finding ways to get him involved. By 1974, Branch wasn't merely a promising receiver anymore. He had become one of the league's most productive weapons. He led the NFL in receiving yards. He was selected to the Pro Bowl, and he established himself as one of the most dangerous big play receivers in football. But this is where the story gets interesting, because Branch wasn't simply collecting statistics in an empty era. He was doing it while playing inside one of the most memorable offensive environments in Raiders history. And the bigger the games became, the more important his role became. The Raiders weren't just trying to win regular season games, they were building toward championships, and Branch became part of that identity. Then came the postseason, and this is where the Hall of Fame argument gets much harder to dismiss. Branch was part of 3 Raiders teams that won the Super Bowl. 3. Not 1, not 2, 3. He was a major component of the Raiders' championship era, and one of the players who helped define their explosive offensive identity. His career eventually ended with 8,685 receiving yards. That number placed him 3rd in Raiders history behind only Tim Brown and Fred Biletnikoff. And there is another number that tells you something about the kind of receiver Branch was. 17.3. That was his career average yards per reception. He wasn't simply catching short passes and piling up receptions. He was stretching the field. He was creating explosive plays. He was making defenses pay for giving him even a little room. And for an offense built around aggression, that mattered enormously. But football history has a strange habit. It remembers the players who dominated the statistics. It remembers quarterbacks. It remembers running backs. It remembers the receiver who catches 100 passes. But sometimes it forgets the player whose greatest value was forcing the defense to worry about what might happen next. Branch was one of those players. You could argue that his greatest contribution wasn't always the catch. It was the fear of the catch. A cornerback couldn't simply ignore him. A safety couldn't casually drift away from him. If Branch got behind the coverage, the play could be over before the defense had time to recover. That threat changed how opponents approached Oakland. And that's exactly what elite players are supposed to do. They don't just produce numbers. They change the decisions their opponents are willing to make. But Branch's career also happened at a difficult time for wide receivers trying to build Hall of Fame cases. The passing game was evolving, statistics were changing, Different eras produced very different offensive numbers. And Branch's career totals didn't have the same visual impact as some of the receivers who came later. That became part of the problem. A modern fan can look at 8,685 receiving yards and wonder why that number should automatically mean Hall of Fame. But that misses the context. Branch wasn't playing in today's pass-heavy NFL. He wasn't operating in an offense where quarterbacks routinely throw 40 or 50 times every Sunday. He played in a different football environment, and judging him without considering that environment can make his accomplishments look smaller than they actually were. There was also another problem. Branch's career wasn't built around one giant statistical season that permanently entered the record books. It was built around sustained excellence and explosive production. He made 4 Pro Bowls. He earned 3 first-team All-Pro selections. He led the league in receiving yards once. He led the league in touchdown receptions twice. And he helped win 3 Super Bowls. That is not the resume of a forgotten role player. That's the resume of someone who was repeatedly among the best players at his position. And yet the Hall continued to remain out of reach. The first major sign that Branch's career might be remembered differently came after retirement. Because once the years passed, people began looking back at what he had actually accomplished. Former players remembered him. Raiders fans remembered him. Writers started revisiting the numbers. And suddenly, the question became impossible to ignore. How was Cliff Branch still not in the Hall of Fame? He wasn't just some player who had a great season. He had been one of the defining weapons of a dynasty. He had been a key part of 3 championship teams. And he had spent his career creating the exact kind of explosive plays that made the Raiders famous. Still, the waiting continued. Branch was a Hall of Fame finalist in 2004, then again in 2010. But neither opportunity resulted in induction. Think about what that means. He wasn't simply forgotten. The Hall had already considered him. He had already reached the stage where voters were seriously discussing his candidacy. He had already been close enough for people to recognize the strength of the case. And yet he still couldn't get over the final barrier. That is what makes the story so frustrating. Because being ignored is one thing. Being repeatedly considered and repeatedly passed over is something else entirely. And then the waiting became personal. Football careers eventually become history. Players retire. Teammates move on. Coaches disappear. The game changes. The younger generation grows up without seeing those players live. And for Branch, the passage of time created a problem that statistics couldn't solve. People who had watched him play were getting older. The game he played was becoming more distant, and the Raiders' explosive 1970s era was becoming something younger fans knew mostly through old footage. The longer the Hall waited, the harder it became for the modern football audience to understand just how dangerous Branch had been. Then, in 2019, Branch died. He was 71 years old. And that changed the emotional weight of the Hall of Fame debate completely. He would never get to walk into Canton himself. He would never hear his name announced while standing among the people who had watched him build that career. He would never have the chance to explain what those years meant to him. The player who had spent decades waiting for recognition was suddenly no longer here to receive it. And that's where the story becomes much bigger than a Hall of Fame resume. Because Branch wasn't simply waiting for a trophy. He represented a generation of Raiders football that had been built around speed, confidence, and championship football. He represented an era when the Raiders were becoming one of the NFL's defining franchises. And he had been there through all of it. Yet the official Hall of Fame still had no place for him. The Raiders themselves have a long list of players in Canton. The franchise currently lists 31 Raiders among the Pro Football Hall of Fame inductees, with Eric Allen becoming the most recent addition in 2025. But Branch remained absent, and that absence became harder to explain. Because look at where Branch ranks in Raiders history. 3rd in receiving yards, 3rd in receptions, 3rd in receiving touchdowns. And the 2 players ahead of him in those major receiving categories are already Hall of Famers, Tim Brown and Fred Biletnikoff. So if Branch's numbers place him directly behind 2 players the Hall already recognizes, what exactly are we supposed to make of that? That's the uncomfortable question. Maybe the argument is that his numbers weren't large enough, but then you have to account for the era. Maybe the argument is that he didn't have enough Pro Bowls, but he had 4. Maybe the argument is that his career wasn't long enough, but he played 14 seasons. Maybe the argument is that he wasn't dominant enough, but he was a 3-time first-team All-Pro and led the NFL in multiple major receiving categories. And maybe the biggest counter-argument of all is that championships shouldn't determine Hall of Fame status. That's fair, they shouldn't. But when the player wasn't simply along for the ride, when he was a major offensive weapon on those championship teams, it becomes relevant evidence. There is something else that makes Branch's case fascinating. His career average of 17.3 yards per reception tells you what kind of player he was. He wasn't accumulating meaningless catches. His job was to create explosive plays, and when you watch old Raiders footage with that in mind, the picture changes. The field suddenly looks different. Defenders are deeper. The ball is moving vertically, and Branch is constantly threatening to get behind the coverage. That threat forces defenders to respect the entire field. And once you understand that, his numbers become more meaningful. Because a receiver's value isn't always captured by how many times he touches the football. Sometimes his greatest contribution is what happens because the defense is terrified of him touching it. And that's exactly why Branch became so important to the Raiders. He gave them something defenses couldn't easily manufacture: instant offense. One mistake, one missed angle, one step too slow, and Branch could turn the entire field upside down. That's the kind of player championship teams need, not necessarily the player who touches the ball every possession. The player who can change the game with one opportunity. And Branch proved he could do that at the highest level, again and again and again. But there was a hidden cost to the way he played. The same speed that made Branch dangerous also made him vulnerable to the brutal physical reality of football. Defenders were constantly trying to disrupt his routes. The game was violent, the hits accumulated, and eventually every great athlete reaches the point where the body begins collecting the bill for everything it gave earlier. Branch was no different. His career ended in 1985. The game moved forward. New receivers arrived. New offenses appeared. New stars became the faces of the NFL. And slowly, Branch's name began disappearing from the mainstream conversation. This is where his downfall really begins. Not a collapse on the field, not a sudden failure, something more painful: obscurity. A player who had once terrified defenses was becoming a footnote. And the longer that happened, the more distorted his legacy became. Younger fans could look at the statistics without understanding the era. They could see the receiving totals without seeing the defenses. They could see the Pro Bowls without seeing the championships. They could see the highlights without understanding how much the Raiders relied on his ability to stretch the field. And they could ask the question, was Cliff Branch really a Hall of Famer? But that question is almost impossible to answer if you only look at a spreadsheet. Because Branch's case isn't about one number, it's about what he represented. A player who changed the geometry of the field. A receiver who became a central weapon on 3 championship teams. A 3-time All-Pro. A 4-time Pro Bowler. A league leader, and a player whose name still sits near the top of the Raiders' receiving record book. Yet the Hall kept saying no. And eventually, that created an uncomfortable reality. Cliff Branch had spent his entire career outrunning defenders. But after retirement, he couldn't outrun time. Every year that passed made the case harder to communicate. Every old teammate who disappeared made the story harder to tell. Every generation that hadn't watched him play made the footage feel more distant. And then Branch himself was gone. But the question remained. If a 3-time champion, 3-time first-team All-Pro, 4-time Pro Bowler, league leader, and one of the defining deep threats of the Raiders' golden era doesn't belong in Canton, then what exactly does? And that question is where Branch's story takes its darkest turn. Because the Hall of Fame snub wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a much bigger argument about how football remembers its legends. And once you look closely at what happened to Cliff Branch after his playing career ended, you realize the most shocking part isn't that he was forgotten. It's how long it took people to realize just how much had already been lost.